The dog should have forgotten the password years ago, but when Staff Sergeant Mason Reed whispered it through the rusted bars, the German Shepherd lifted one paw like time had never touched him. It happened on a gray afternoon near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where rain moved across the old farm roads in thin silver sheets, and the hills looked tired beneath a low sky. Mason was 37, a white U.S. Marine with close-cut brown hair, gray-blue eyes, and the quiet posture of a man who still listened before he entered a room. He had been driving past an abandoned training property on the edge of town, a place he had not visited in almost 8 years, when he heard the sound. Not a bark, not a cry, a faint scrape of metal from behind a sagging fence. He stopped his pickup near the gravel shoulder and sat for a moment with one hand on the wheel, rain ticking against the windshield. The old sign by the gate was half fallen. The letters faded until only Whitaker K-9 training could still be read if someone already knew what they were looking for. Mason knew. Gunnery Sergeant Paul Whitaker had trained dogs there after retiring from the Marine Corps, and years ago he had trained Mason there too, not just in commands, but in patience. A good dog never forgets the voice that treated him like family, Paul used to say. Mason stepped out into the rain and pushed through the gate, his boots sinking into wet weeds. Behind the main barn, past a row of empty runs and cracked water bowls, stood a rusted kennel with a padlock hanging crooked from the latch. Inside, barely visible in the dim light, sat a German Shepherd. He was male, full-grown, sable black and tan, too thin beneath his wet coat, but still upright with the disciplined stillness of a working dog who had not surrendered his training. His amber eyes watched Mason without panic, without trust, just waiting. Mason's throat tightened. "Hey, boy," he said softly. The dog did not move. Rain slid from the kennel roof and tapped into a metal bowl turned upside down by the door. Mason saw the old collar then, worn nearly smooth, with a tag so darkened by time he had to lift his flashlight to read it. Atlas. The name struck him harder than the cold. Atlas had belonged to Paul Whitaker. Atlas had vanished after Paul got sick, after papers were misplaced, after people promised to call and never did. Mason had searched shelters, county lists, old contacts, and every dead-end lead until the silence made him feel like he had failed both the man and the dog. Now Atlas sat behind rusted bars 8 miles from Mason's rented house, as if all those missing years had been waiting for one rainy afternoon. Mason lowered himself to one knee, keeping his hands open. He did not know why the old words came back then. Maybe grief remembers what the mind tries to bury. Maybe loyalty leaves markers only the heart can read. Mason leaned closer to the kennel and whispered, "Blue Harbor." Atlas changed. His ears lifted. His spine straightened. Then, slow and trembling, he raised one front paw and placed it against the lower bar of the kennel door. Mason stopped breathing. Paul's private password. The training phrase only a few men had ever known. The dog remembered. Mason pressed his palm against the opposite side of the bar, not touching Atlas, but close enough for the space between them to feel holy. "You remember," he whispered. Atlas held the position for 3 seconds, then lowered his head until his nose touched Mason's fingers through the rust. In that moment, the abandoned property no longer felt empty. It felt like an old promise had finally found someone willing to hear it. Mason did not cut the lock. He did not kick the door. He stayed on one knee in the rain with his palm near the rusted bar and let Atlas decide whether the old world could still be trusted. The German Shepherd's nose rested against Mason's fingers for one quiet breath, then another. His coat smelled of wet iron, mud, and the sour loneliness of a place no living thing should have been asked to call home. Mason felt anger rise in him, sharp and immediate, but he pushed it down where Atlas could not mistake it for danger. A frightened dog did not need a man's fury. He needed a steady voice. "Blue Harbor," Mason whispered again, softer this time. Atlas lifted his head. His amber eyes held on to Mason's face, searching through years, rain, hunger, and abandonment for something familiar enough to believe. Mason remembered Paul Whitaker standing on this same property 8 years earlier, older than everyone else, but somehow faster at seeing the truth in a dog. Paul had worn an old canvas jacket, carried peppermints in one pocket, and spoke to every K-9 as if discipline and kindness were the same language. "Never command before you listen," he used to tell Mason. "A good handler opens the door twice, once with his hand, once with his heart." Mason looked at the padlock. It was old, but not broken. Someone had closed it. Someone had chosen not to come back often enough. He took a set of bolt cutters from the bed of his pickup, moving slowly, explaining every step in a low voice as if Atlas understood more than words. Maybe he did. The cutters bit through the weakened metal with a dull snap that echoed against the empty barn. Atlas did not flinch. He only watched Mason set the lock aside and lift the latch. The kennel door resisted, stuck in rust and swollen wood. Mason pulled once, then stopped when the metal groaned too loudly. Atlas stood inside, thin legs steady but strained. "Easy," Mason said. He worked the door back and forth until it opened wide enough for a dog to pass. Then he stepped away. For a long moment, Atlas did nothing. Rain fell through a gap in the roof and darkened the dirt between them. Mason could see a cracked water bowl, a flattened strip of old blanket, and a canvas pouch hanging from a wire hook inside the kennel door. Atlas looked at the open space, then at Mason, then back into the kennel, as if leaving required permission from a life that was no longer there. Mason felt his chest tighten. "You do not have to stay there anymore." Atlas took one step. His paw touched wet grass. He paused, trembling from effort rather than fear. Then he took another step and lowered his head into Mason's open hand. Mason closed his fingers gently around the thick fur at the side of the dog's neck, not gripping, just letting Atlas feel the answer. "Yes, you are real. Yes, I found you. Yes, I should have come sooner." The old collar shifted beneath his hand, and the tag caught the gray light. "Atlas, property of Whitaker, K-9 training." Mason swallowed hard. "I looked for you," he whispered. Atlas leaned heavier against him. No accusation, no question, just weight, warmth, and the unbearable mercy of being accepted by the one you failed to find. Mason removed his field jacket and draped it over Atlas's back. The German shepherd's body was too lean beneath it, but his posture remained proud, as if Paul's training still lived somewhere deeper than hunger. Mason reached into the kennel and took down the canvas pouch. Atlas lifted his head immediately, ears forward. He stepped close, pressing his shoulder against Mason's leg, eyes fixed on the pouch with a focus that turned the rainy property still. Mason did not open it yet. Something about the way Atlas watched told him the pouch was not trash, not an old supply bag, not forgotten clutter. It was another door. Mason tucked it under one arm, guided Atlas toward the pickup, and called Dr. Emily Carter before he even started the engine. As the truck rolled away from the abandoned property, Atlas lay across the back seat under Mason's jacket, one paw resting on the canvas pouch, as if guarding the next piece of a promise that had waited too long in the rain. Dr. Emily Carter was waiting beneath the covered side entrance of her small veterinary clinic when Mason pulled in, the rain turning the parking lot silver under the security lights. She had a towel over one arm, a medical bag in the other, and the calm face of someone who knew that fear entered buildings before animals did. Mason opened the back door of the pickup slowly. Atlas lifted his head from beneath the field jacket, one paw still resting on the canvas pouch. His amber eyes moved from Emily to Mason, asking without sound whether this new place belonged to safety. "Blue Harbor," Mason whispered. The German shepherd exhaled, then allowed Mason to help him down. His legs trembled when his paws touched the pavement, but he did not collapse. Pride held him upright where strength almost failed. Emily did not reach for him. She knelt a few feet away and laid the towel on the ground like an invitation. "Hello, Atlas," she said softly. "You have had a long day." At the sound of his name, Atlas looked at her, then stepped onto the towel with the careful obedience of a dog who had once been taught that mats, thresholds, and voices all mattered. Emily's eyes flicked to Mason. He was trained well. Mason's throat tightened. "By the best man I ever knew." Inside, the clinic was warm and quiet, smelling of clean blankets, antiseptic, and dry food. Emily led them to an exam room with dimmed lights and a rubber mat already spread across the floor. Atlas refused to leave the canvas pouch in the truck, so Mason carried it inside, and the dog watched every inch of its movement. During the exam, Atlas stood still when Emily checked his ears, eyes, paws, ribs, and heartbeat. He was underweight, dehydrated, and tired in a way sleep alone would not fix, but he never snapped, never fought, never lost the discipline Paul Whitaker had planted in him years ago. When Emily touched the worn collar tag, Mason looked away for half a second. not enough to hide it from her. "You know this dog," she said. Mason nodded. "I knew who he belonged to." Emily cleaned mud from one paw and wrapped a small sore spot with soft gauze. "Then maybe that is why he waited for your voice." Mason set the canvas pouch on the counter. Atlas's head rose immediately. His body leaned forward, not anxious exactly, but urgent. Emily noticed. That bag matters to him. Mason opened it carefully. The zipper resisted, stiff with age and grit. Inside were a darkened marine dog tag stamped Paul Whitaker, a torn corner of an old photograph, and a folded paper sealed in a plastic sleeve. Mason held the dog tag first. It was cold and heavy in his palm, and for a moment the clinic disappeared. He saw Paul laughing beside the training fence, Paul tapping 2 fingers against his chest when giving the private signal, Paul saying that loyalty was not a command but a relationship. Mason unfolded the paper with hands he could not quite steady. The writing was Paul's, older and shakier than Mason remembered, but unmistakable. If he remembers Blue Harbor, he found the right man. Mason read the sentence once. Then again. The room went very still. Emily said nothing. Atlas stepped forward until his nose touched Mason's wrist, right below the dog tag. Mason lowered himself onto the floor beside him, the paper in one hand, the tag in the other. "You were not just waiting to get out," he whispered. Atlas leaned into him, warm beneath the borrowed jacket. "You were waiting to be recognized." Emily turned toward the cabinet and gave them privacy without leaving the room. Rain whispered against the clinic windows. The old password had opened the kennel, but now Mason understood it had opened something deeper. Paul had not left a command. He had left a test of memory, trust, and mercy. And Atlas, thin and tired and faithful beyond reason, had passed it alone in the dark until Mason finally came close enough to say the words. Mason stayed on the clinic floor longer than he meant to, one hand resting against Atlas's shoulder, the other holding Paul Whitaker's dog tag, as if the metal might tell him how to forgive himself. Atlas did not sleep, though his body begged for it. He sat close to Mason, eyes fixed on the canvas pouch and the folded note now lying on the exam room counter. Dr. Emily Carter moved quietly around them, preparing fluids, warm food, and a clean blanket, never treating the old German shepherd like a problem to solve quickly. She treated him like a life that had waited too long to be rushed. "He needs rest," she said gently. Mason nodded, but he kept looking at the note. If he remembers Blue Harbor, he found the right man. The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they opened the old wound fully. Mason remembered the winter Paul got sick, the phone calls, the confusion over papers, the promise Mason made beside a hospital bed with fluorescent light on the walls. "I will find him," Mason had told Paul. Paul had squeezed his wrist with a hand that had once trained stubborn dogs and younger Marines with equal patience. "Do not force the door, Reed," Paul had whispered. "Listen for it." Mason had not understood. After Paul passed, Atlas vanished into records, transfers, and names no one could confirm. Mason called shelters, drove back roads, asked men who had forgotten what they promised. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually, people told him he had done enough. Mason believed them on the outside. Inside, he carried the failure like a stone in his boot, always there, always shaping the way he walked. Atlas shifted and placed his paw on Mason's knee. Not the salute from the kennel. Something smaller, heavier, present. Emily watched from the cabinet. "There may be someone who can explain the note," she said. Mason looked up. "Linda Whitaker." Emily nodded. "She still lives outside town, near the apple orchard. She brings her cat in every spring. She asks about old training dogs whenever she comes." Mason closed his eyes. He had not visited Linda in years. Shame had a way of making distance look respectful. "She deserves to know he is alive," Emily said. Mason opened his eyes and looked at Atlas. "Yes," he said. "She does." He called Linda from the hallway while Atlas watched through the open exam room door. The phone rang 4 times. When she answered, her voice was careful, older, but still carrying the warmth Mason remembered from Sunday lunches at Paul's kitchen table. "Mrs. Whitaker," Mason said, and the title alone seemed to pull years into the line. "It is Mason Reed." There was a pause, then a soft breath. "Mason." He held the dog tag tighter. "I found Atlas." Silence. Not empty silence. A silence so full it could barely stand. Then Linda whispered, "Say that again." Mason looked through the doorway. Atlas had lifted his head at her voice coming faintly through the phone, ears forward, eyes bright with recognition that crossed wires, years, and rain. Mason's throat tightened. I found him at the old property. He is safe now. He remembered Blue Harbor. On the other end, Linda began to cry quietly, not the kind of crying that asks to be comforted, but the kind that happens when a prayer you buried comes walking back. Paul said he would, she whispered. He said if Atlas ever heard that from the right person, he would know. Mason leaned against the hallway wall. Mrs. Whitaker, I am sorry. I should have found him sooner. Her voice was gentle, but firm enough to stop him. Bring him to me when Emily says he can travel. Not because you failed, Mason, because he came back. Mason could not answer for a moment. In the exam room, Atlas stood despite his weakness and took one slow step toward the sound of Linda's voice. Mason lowered the phone, and the old German shepherd touched his nose to the speaker. Linda heard the soft breath and broke into a laugh full of tears. Hello, Atlas, she said. Atlas closed his eyes. Mason stood there in the warm clinic hallway, rain fading outside, Paul's dog tag in his palm, and understood that the password had not only opened a kennel. It had opened every locked room where grief had been waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Atlas spent the night at Emily Carter's clinic beneath a warm blanket, sleeping in short, cautious stretches as if rest still required permission. Mason slept in a chair beside him, boots planted on the floor, Paul Whitaker's dog tag resting on the small table near the canvas pouch. Every time Atlas stirred, Mason opened his eyes. Every time Mason shifted, Atlas lifted his head. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving Gettysburg washed in pale light, and the clinic windows bright with water trails. Emily checked Atlas's vitals, offered small portions of food, and smiled only after the German shepherd ate, without looking toward the door. He is stronger than he looks, she said. But do not mistake discipline for wellness. He needs quiet, steady meals, clean water, and time. Mason nodded. He will have all of it. Emily's face softened. And you? Mason looked at Atlas, who had lowered his head over the canvas pouch like it was a sleeping pup. I am still learning what I need. Late that morning, Deputy Mark Collins arrived at the clinic. He was a broad-shouldered local officer in his 40s, with rain-dark boots and a notebook tucked under one arm. Mason had known him in passing, the way small towns make strangers familiar through gas stations, diner booths, and school football games remembered by everyone except the people who played them. Mark listened as Mason described the property, the rusted kennel, the lock, the pouch, and the note. He did not interrupt. When Mason finished, Mark looked through the exam room window at Atlas. That old Whitaker place changed hands after Paul passed, he said. Earl Bennett bought part of it. Claimed he was going to turn the barn into storage units. Never did much except put up no trespassing signs and complain about taxes. Mason felt Atlas watching them through the glass. Someone knew he was there. Mark's jaw tightened. Then we asked carefully and document better than they lied. They drove back to the property just after noon, Mason following Mark's cruiser along the wet farm road. Atlas came too, with Emily's approval, riding in the back seat on a thick blanket because Mason would not bring the pouch without him and Atlas would not let the pouch leave his sight. The old training property looked smaller in daylight, more tired than haunted. Empty runs lined the barn. Weeds grew through cracked concrete. The kennel door stood open where Mason had left it, rust flakes dark against the grass. Atlas stepped down from the truck slowly. His body leaned toward Mason, but his eyes went to the kennel. He did not shake. He did not pull away. He simply looked at the place that had held him and then looked back at Mason, as if comparing the two doors life had given him. Mark took photographs. The old bull, the blanket strip, the lock, the hook where the pouch had hung. Near the office door, a pickup rolled in, and Earl Bennett climbed out wearing a clean tan jacket and the irritated expression of a man inconvenienced by someone else's suffering. What is this about? He called. Mark answered evenly, following up on an animal neglect report. Earl glanced at Atlas and shrugged. That dog was old. Hard to manage. I figured somebody from Whitaker's people would come eventually. Mason felt the word strike, but he did not step forward. Atlas did. Just one pace. Calm. Silent. Earl looked away first. Mark wrote that down too. Mason understood then that justice did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrived with a notebook, a camera, a witness, and a dog still dignified enough to make the guilty man lower his eyes. Earl Bennett kept his hands in the pockets of his clean tin jacket, standing near the old office door as if the property still owed him respect. Deputy Mark Collins asked questions in a calm voice, writing down each answer before the next one could hide behind it. When did Earl last come to the property? Who had been responsible for the kennel? Did he know Atlas had belonged to Paul Whitaker? Had he contacted Linda Whitaker, Emily Carter, or anyone from the old training records? Earl answered the way some men did when truth made them uncomfortable, with shrugs, half-sentences, and blame passed to people who were not standing there. "I thought the dog had been picked up," he said once. Then, 5 minutes later, "I thought he wandered in." Mark paused and looked at him over the top of his notebook. Mason said nothing. Atlas stood beside him, thin but steady, rainwater dripping from the barn roof behind them. The old German shepherd did not understand paperwork, excuses, or property transfers. But he understood tone. Each time Earl spoke, Atlas's ears shifted forward, and each time Mason laid 2 fingers lightly against his collar, reminding him and himself that quiet could be stronger than anger. Mark walked the length of the kennel row, photographing the rusted latch, the worn path between the kennel and the barn, the bag of old feed tucked behind a board, and the hose that no longer worked. Near the rear wall, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His body changed in a way Mason recognized from training years ago. Not fear. Scent. Memory. The dog stepped away from the kennel and moved toward a wide oak tree behind the barn, walking slowly because of his weakness, but with growing certainty. Mason followed. Mark followed too. Earl called after them. "There is nothing back there." Atlas stopped at the base of the oak and placed one paw on the wet ground between 2 exposed roots. Then he looked up at Mason. The gesture was so deliberate that Mason felt the afternoon narrow around it. "Blue Harbor," Mason whispered. Atlas pressed his paw down once, then stepped back. Mark knelt and brushed leaves aside with gloved hands. Beneath the mud was the corner of a small metal box, dark with age but not ruined. Mason's breath caught. Together, he and Mark worked it free. Earl had gone quiet. The box opened with a stubborn scrape. Inside, sealed in plastic, were a folded letter, an old training patch from Whitaker K9, and a photograph of Paul, Mason, and Atlas standing beside the same oak years earlier. Mason touched the edge of the photograph without lifting it. In the picture, Atlas looked young and strong. Paul had one hand on Mason's shoulder, smiling like he already knew someday the image would matter. Mark looked at the letter. "It has your name on it." Mason took it with both hands. The paper inside was dry, Paul's handwriting careful but weakened by age. Mason read the first line and felt the world soften beneath him. If Atlas still answers, then loyalty outlived the silence. He stopped there. His eyes burned, but he did not look away. Paul wrote that if Mason was reading the letter, then Atlas had found his way back through memory, not luck. He wrote that Mason was not to carry blame for every door other men failed to open. He wrote that a promise sometimes survives longer than the people who made it, and when it comes back, the only faithful thing to do is receive it. Atlas leaned against Mason's leg, warm and quiet. Mark stood beside them, hat in hand now, the notebook lowered. Even Earl Bennett had no words left. Mason folded the letter carefully and placed it against his chest. For years, he had believed Atlas was the proof of his failure. Now, beneath the oak behind the old barn, he understood the dog had been carrying something else entirely. Not accusation, not loss, a message. And somehow, through rust, rain, hunger, and silence, Atlas had kept it safe until the right voice finally spoke the old password again. Mason read Paul's letter again in the cab of his pickup, while the old training property blurred behind the windshield in a soft veil of rain. Atlas lay across the back seat on the blanket Emily had given him, his head resting near the canvas pouch, his eyes half closed but not fully asleep. Deputy Mark Collins had taken photographs, statements, and the metal box into evidence, except for the letter, the patch, and the copy of the photograph Paul had clearly meant for Mason to keep. Earl Bennett stayed behind with Mark, answering questions that seemed to grow heavier each time he tried to make them smaller. Mason drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, feeling the letter folded in his shirt pocket like a second heartbeat. Paul's words would not leave him. Do not carry blame for every door other men failed to open. It sounded simple, It was not. For years, Mason had built a quiet room inside himself and filled it with every call he should have made, every road he should have driven, every name he should have pushed harder to find. He had called that room responsibility because guilt sounded too weak for a Marine. But Atlas had not come out of the kennel angry. Linda had not answered the phone with blame. Paul had not left him a final accusation beneath the oak. The people who loved him best had all given him the same impossible order. Come back. At Emily's clinic, Mason helped Atlas out of the truck and carried the canvas pouch inside. The German shepherd moved stiffly, but he walked closer to Mason than before, no longer simply following the pouch, no longer guarding the past from everyone. Emily met them at the exam room door and read Mason's face before asking anything. You found more than records, she said. Mason nodded and handed her the photograph. Emily looked at it quietly, Paul smiling, young Mason standing too straight, Atlas bright-eyed between them, the oak tree behind them like a witness. He wanted you to have proof, she said. Mason sat on the floor beside Atlas. Proof of what? Emily knelt to check Atlas's bandage. That you were part of the promise, not the failure. The words entered him slowly, because mercy often needs to be heard more than once before it is believed. That evening, after Atlas ate and settled on a clean blanket, Mason called Linda Whitaker again. He read Paul's letter to her over the phone, not all at once, but carefully, stopping whenever her breath caught. When he reached the line about loyalty outliving silence, Linda whispered, that was Paul. He always trusted love to find the long way around. Atlas lifted his head at her voice. Mason lowered the phone, and Linda spoke directly to him. Atlas, you stubborn old gentleman, you did exactly what he asked. Atlas closed his eyes, and his tail moved once against the blanket. Mason laughed softly before he could stop himself. It was small, rusted at the edges, but it was a laugh. Later, when the clinic lights dimmed and rain faded into the gutters, Mason sat beside Atlas in the quiet. He took Paul's dog tag from the pouch and placed it next to the training patch on the folded jacket. Then he rested his hand near Atlas's paw. Blue Harbor, he whispered. Atlas did not sit at attention this time. He did not perform the old command. He simply reached out and placed his paw over Mason's hand, warm, steady, forgiving. Mason bowed his head. For the first time since Paul died, he did not ask the past to explain why it had hurt him. He only let the living answer remain. 3 days later, Emily Carter cleared Atlas for a short visit to Linda Whitaker's house. As long as Mason promised to keep the afternoon quiet and the walk from the truck to the porch slow. Mason made the promise twice. Atlas rode beside him in the back seat, stronger than he had been, but still thin beneath the clean sable black and tan coat Emily had brushed until it shone in the Pennsylvania sun. The canvas pouch rested on the seat between them, holding Paul's dog tag, the training patch, the photograph, and the letter that had turned guilt into something Mason could finally set down. Linda lived outside Gettysburg near a small apple orchard, in a white farmhouse with green shutters and wind chimes hanging beside the porch steps. When Mason pulled into the gravel drive, Atlas lifted his head before the truck stopped. His ears moved forward. His nose touched the glass. Memory had found the house before his paws did. Linda opened the front door and stood very still, one hand pressed to her chest, her silver hair moving softly in the breeze. Mason stepped out first, then opened the back door and helped Atlas down. The German shepherd paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with eyes that had crossed too many lonely years to arrive empty. Linda came down slowly, one step at a time. Atlas, she whispered. The dog gave one quiet breath and walked to her. He did not jump. He did not whine loudly. He simply pressed his head against her knees and closed his eyes. Linda folded both hands over his ears and bent toward him, tears falling onto his clean fur. Paul knew, she said. He always said you would remember your way back. Mason stood beside the truck, letting the reunion belong to them. The yard smelled of cut grass, apple blossoms, and warm wood from the porch rail. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird called once, then went quiet, as if even the afternoon understood. Inside the farmhouse, Linda had cleared a small table near the window. Mason placed Paul's dog tag there first, then the training patch, then the photograph of Paul, younger Mason, and Atlas beneath the oak tree. Linda touched the frame with 2 fingers. He kept that picture in his workshop, she said. Said it reminded him that loyalty is not taught in a day. Atlas lay on the rug near their feet, chin on his paws, watching the table without anxiety now. For once, the things from the past were not hidden in a pouch or buried in mud. They were in the light. Linda made tea. Mason barely drank his. He told her about the kennel, the pouch, the oak tree, the way Atlas had placed his paw on the ground, as if pointing to a sentence no one else could read. Linda listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him with the same gentle firmness Paul once had. Mason, you did not fail him. You answered when he called. Mason looked down at Atlas. It took me years. Linda nodded. Some calls have to travel through a lot of silence. Before they left, Linda walked them to the porch. The sun had lowered over the orchard, turning the gravel road gold. Mason helped Atlas into the truck, then paused with one hand on the door. Blue Harbor, he said softly. Atlas sat taller, not because he had to obey, but because the words now meant safety. He placed one paw on the edge of Mason's sleeve. Linda smiled through tears. Mason smiled back, and for the first time, the old password did not sound like a test. It sounded like home answering. By early May, the hills outside Gettysburg had turned green again, and Atlas had begun to look less like a dog rescued from a forgotten place and more like the proud German shepherd Paul Whitaker had raised. His coat filled out. His eyes brightened. His steps grew steadier along the quiet road behind Mason's rented house, where morning fog lifted from the fields and birds called from the fence posts. Mason built a small wooden shelf by the front window, not as a shrine, but as a place for truth to rest in the open. Paul's dog tag hung beside the Whitaker K9 training patch. The photograph stood in a simple frame. The folded letter stayed beneath it, read often enough that Mason no longer felt afraid of the words. Deputy Mark Collins continued his report, and Earl Bennett faced the consequences through the proper channels. But Mason did not build his healing around another man's failure. He built it around water bowls filled every morning, slow walks in the sun, quiet visits to Emily Carter's clinic, and Sunday afternoons at Linda Whitaker's farmhouse, where Atlas slept on the porch while Linda spoke about Paul without breaking apart. One morning, Mason drove Atlas back to the old training property, not to reopen the wound, to change what it meant. The rusted kennel door had been removed, the empty bowls cleared away, and the oak behind the barn stood bright with new leaves. Mason carried a small cedar marker he had made by hand and set it near the tree roots where Atlas had found the box. On it, he had carved 4 words: "Loyalty outlived the silence." Atlas walked to the spot, sniffed the earth, then looked back at Mason. There was no fear in him now, only recognition. Mason knelt beside him and rested one hand in the grass. "Blue Harbor," he said softly. Atlas sat beside him and placed one paw over Mason's hand, warm and steady. The same answer he had given in the clinic, the farmhouse, and every morning since. The old password had once opened a rusted kennel. Then it opened a pouch, a hidden box, a grieving widow's heart, and the locked room inside Mason where blame had waited too long. Now it opened nothing made of metal. It opened the day. Sunlight moved across Atlas's face. The German shepherd leaned his shoulder into Mason, and Mason let himself lean back. Some promises do not survive because they are kept perfectly. They survive because love keeps searching after people stop knowing where to look. And sometimes, when the right voice finally speaks the old words, what was lost remembers the way home.